So my Sunday night routine lately, for the last several weeks at least, has been, after church of course, and after dinner, to turn on the FX channel and watch a show called Pose. And I wonder if anyone here has also seen it. Anyone? Right. Yeah. So I urge you to see it. If you're interested, I think that you will be entertained, engaged, and in my case, I've been deeply moved each week. Pose is part of a trend right now of using, reclaiming our LGBT past by telling stories that hadn't been told extensively previously, and doing them in such a way that that they're helping us think about how to be in the world in the present. So I can give a number of examples of this. There have been several movies, several books. I saw a revival on Broadway, I may have mentioned a month or two ago, of The Boys in the Band, which was written in the late 60s and then seen in the 70s, and at the time was very cutting edge and may seem to us to be outdated. But I will tell you, I was struck by how many phrases that gay men of my generation, at least, have used freely, and to find them all enshrined there in that play. This particular show, Pose, retells the story of drag houses, for lack of a better word. I'm trying to use the language that is depicted and used by the people then, recognizing it may seem outdated or even of low consciousness when we say the words today. It's hard to tell the story without using the words that people use, right? So it tells the story of what it meant to be transgender, what it meant to use words that are used frequently in the movie or in the show, transvestite or transsexual, also to be LGBT of any sort in that period in New York City, and particularly focuses on young African American and Latino youth who are living at that time, many of whom are sex workers in the Village, at the piers on Christopher Street, the end of Christopher Street, if you've been to New York, you know that area, or in other parts of town, in Times Square, because that's the only employment that they can find. And they create homes and houses together, and the movie or the show, Pose, is focused on these extravagant balls, costume balls, masquerade balls, that were popularized in popular culture through entertainers like Madonna, but had their origin and their vitality there in Harlem, where they were run by and for this marginalized, even in the gay community, population. So you might remember a documentary from the 90s called Paris is Burning. That showed this story as well. And there is a novel that came out in February that was well reviewed called The House of Impossible Beauties by Joseph Cassara, that also tells this story. But now it's right there on FX, on the FX channel. And as I said, it's become part of my Sunday night experience to be here at our LGBTQ affirming church. And this is the only time all week that I'm ever with LGBTQ people in a group. Right? I live in West Roxbury, like many of us. We live all over the area. I pastor a church, United Church of Christ Congregational Church in Needham, that many of you have been to or visited, where I believe this is true. I'm the only gay man, though there are there are some lesbians there, and we're a nice, affirmed and welcomed and embraced group. But I value coming here to this self-determined LGBTQ welcoming space where we also have allies who worship with us. I value that. I don't know if you see it that way too, as a kind of a free space, a sanctuary, a time where I can really be myself spiritually, as well as, I'm a big old gay guy, so I like having the freedom to do that. And that does not fly so well in Needham, so the big old gay guy part. Although people are very friendly and polite, I don't mean that. But there's a certain something that happens when we come together in spaces like this that are necessary for our souls to flourish, I think. And so I have this Sunday night experience at MCC Boston, then I go home and I watch Pose. And I see the stories of, to use the words of the time, drag queens, cross-dressers, transgender people, principally, or gender non-conforming people, as well as other kinds on a spectrum of gay and bisexual and lesbian. There's a whole realm who have created these communities that are almost invisible to the broader world. But on Friday night or Saturday night, they're an extravagant celebration of non-conformity and of beauty also, and of safety, and kind of a little promise for what the future might be like someday. Pose, uniquely right now, has 5 actual transgender actors playing transgender roles. So they're not using cisgender people. This is a huge breakthrough in terms of what commercial media has brought to us in the past. And the stories, though they are very much about the 1980s, about what it meant to be gay then, about what it meant also to experience racism, not only in the broader culture, but in the gay community. It depicts what it meant to be gender non-conforming. Who remembers the 1980s? Anyone? I was there. Not everyone here. Bless your hearts if you weren't. It's not unlike the present time. It's different, but not unlike it. There was a lot of repression, a lot of oppression, and it was reflected in our choice of government at the time. That's the nicest way to say it, I think. So this story, though very much set in the past, is as much about the present, I think. And each week I think, this will be curious, I'll enjoy watching it. And usually by 50 minutes into it, I'm doing an ugly cry, and I mean ugly cry, because of something that is depicted that I had either forgotten or repressed or just hadn't dealt with in a long time. Last week's episode, I won't spoil it, but was all about AIDS and how people took care of each other in the 1980s when you were in the hospital and you couldn't necessarily count on people bringing your food into your room. It had to be brought for you. So there's the most unforgettable scene about creating home and a safe space, particularly focusing on HIV. Now, it's a long introduction, but it's salient because there's a quote that I put on the cover of the bulletin, and poor Paul thought I had made a mistake or that I had lost my mind, and it's always a possibility. But I'm quoting from Blanca, who is one of the 2 principal characters. There are 2 house mothers. Houses are groups that are composed of people who dance together in these balls, also live together, often work together. They're chosen family, right? And they're called houses. There's the house of Evangelista. There's the house of Extravaganza. That's depicted in some other films right now. And then the house of Abundance that is run by, let's just say, a rival house mother. Blanca is the head of the house of Evangelista, and Electra is the head of the house of Abundance. And this is a quote by Blanca. Balls, these dances, dance events, dance doesn't even do that. Balls are a gathering of people who are not welcome to gather anywhere else. So this may not sound like a profound sociological observation, but it just went right to my heart because I thought about what MCC was then and still is. A gathering for people, church people, who may not be welcome to gather anywhere else. We are welcome to gather many more places today than we were then, but we kid ourselves if we think there's not still homophobia, racism, AIDS phobia, gynophobia, or misogyny, the hatred of women. I can only say this because it has to be said in a church somewhere. A Christian church has to say this, and I hope that there are hundreds doing it. That a week and a half ago, I was shamed by our country's opposition to breastfeeding at the United Nations, trying to discourage breastfeeding as a natural form of feeding babies, and siding with corporations like Nestle and others who were promoting the use of milk substitutes particularly in poorer countries. And the U.S. shamefully, if you follow the international press, was opposed to this. And this evidence was opposed to breastfeeding, actually. It's embarrassing. And it has partly to do with shame about women's bodies and lack of knowledge. And so in a church in the United States, it's important to say, in the face of all these kinds of prejudices that weren't just back then, but are happening still, we affirm the beauty of women's bodies and also the naturalness of breastfeeding. I never thought I would have to say that in church, but I think someone needs to say it in church because some of the opposition is somewhat religiously based. So these things are still happening, and these houses that are described in Poe's are lifted up to us as examples of contemporary communities of resistance to oppression in the broader society, where people can gather together and self-determine without fear of judgment or criticism from the outside and live their life fully, creatively, in a way that they are not able to live the rest of their lives. And they're a promise of what the future can be. This is what Blanca, this is what she says the balls are. And I think that it's important for us to affirm expressions in contemporary culture, particularly LGBTQ culture, that also speak to us about the religion of Jesus and what Jesus stood for and what Jesus calls us to be like in the world today, because the scripture passage tonight does that. I do want to urge you to go back and watch Pose. It's still, all the episodes are still on demand if you have the opportunity, because there are some moving things that depict how people who choose community care for each other. Here's one example. There's another character named Pray, P-R-A-Y, Pray Tell, and he is describing with Blanca the importance of doing AIDS testing. This is in the 80s, and I remember when there was this big conversation then about whether or not to get tested when the testing was new, because we didn't trust what the government would do with the information. That was the reason. Blanca says, you should have heard the young people in this house that she superintends, that she's the mother of. You should have heard them talking like not knowing anything, what's an okay thing. And Pray says to her, you're young. She says, that's my point. They don't know. I'm not going to use the language of the movie because FX is a little more X-rated than church. They don't know anything about anything. It's my job to teach them. What's the point in being their mother if I can't teach them to protect themselves from the one thing we all know is coming? Pray says, then tell them to be careful. Blanca says, they're kids. Most of the grown men we know aren't careful. They got to get checked, and not just for their sake. They need to know so they don't hurt nobody else. And then Pray says, I stopped getting tested. What? Blanca says. Pray says, after Custis got sick and I saw how the AZT made him sicker, he's not the first. I know about 5 people where the drugs killed them before the virus did. Blanca says, you didn't know that. And Pray says, I know that Ronald Reagan will not say the word AIDS. Health insurance will not cover any treatment. The world wants us dead. They don't think this is a plague. They think it's some sort of divine justice or Darwin's answer for Sodom. So this house with a mother cares for her adult, mostly gay and bisexual children by urging them and going with them to get tested. This is godlike love. This is maternal love in the best sense, or parental love. And this is Jesus-like love, as I want to show in the scripture. I'm going to give one other quote from the movie, or from the show. Electra and Blanca end up becoming deeply mutually detesting rivals, right? So do they love each other? Do they hate each other? Hard to say. Electra has one house, Blanca has another. So what's your story? Electra says, let me guess, Mommy kicked you out after catching you in a dress. Where are you staying? Blanca says, usually at Washington Square. Some nights I get a bed at the youth shelter. And she asks, Electra asks her, why did you walk in the ball tonight when you didn't even have the right clothing? This is just when Blanca had first come out, she was a teenager. And she says, can I be honest with you? I don't think I'll ever be as real as you. No one questions you or your looks or the way they do me. It's not that I give a darn about what people think, but I do want to be seen and respected as a woman. That's who I see myself to be. Electra says, you think I just woke up one day and poof, I look like this? No, it takes work, drive, sacrifice to be a woman. You have something rarer than you do though. You have heart, and you're not afraid to lead with it. That quality will get you everything. Now, what is it that you want, my child? Blanca says, I don't want to be cold again, and I don't want to be laughed at again. I want to be real. Electra says to her, you're coming home with mother. Wait, you want to be my mother? Blanca says. Electra says, no, I am your mother. This is the kind of history we want to reclaim right now, because we need it more than ever to deal with what we are facing in regard to rising prejudice against our community and also rising prejudice against other oppressed communities. I don't know if any of you saw Larry Kramer's editorial in the New York Times this week, his op-ed piece. And he's angry and old, and he says, I get to be angry and old, basically. And he says, pay attention to what's happening. I won't even quote from it, I'll tell you it's worth looking at. So, what does all this have to do with the gospel tonight and with Jesus? I knew when I looked at the gospel for this week that I was watching unfold week after week on Sunday nights on the FX channel a story that was as real and as spiritual as what Jesus was trying to accomplish in the first century. Even though religion is the enemy for the people in Blanca and Electra's world, and sometimes has been our enemy too, it also contains within it. And this is why I gather here on Sunday nights. My fundamental belief that our Christian faith also contains the seeds for our liberation. I am not self-hating. Nobody else here is self-hating. There was two lines in Boys in the Band that really just knocked me out when I heard them a month ago. One is, show me a happy homosexual and I'll show you a dead homosexual. These were gay guys gathered in their apartment, drinking and carrying on in the 1960s. A very hopeless, kind of nihilistic view about their possibilities for the future. And another character then says, I wish we could all stop hating each other, ourselves, quite so very much. And you could have heard a pin drop in that theater. And by the way, this is Boys in the Band. I was there for opening night. There were more gay men there than any other time I've ever been anywhere in my life. In that moment, people have criticized that line, but who doesn't understand what that character is expressing? We're not here because we're self-hating queers who are here to be punished by Christianity. We're here because we believe that Jesus Christ has a word of liberation for us as we are, as GLBTQ people. And here's an example of it. In this passage from Mark's Gospel, they've been traveling around and doing all kinds of things. And it says that the apostles gathered around Jesus and told them they had all what they had been doing, what they had done and taught. They were doing it in groups. It wasn't just about Jesus anymore. It was what they were doing in his stead, in his name. Many were coming and going, and this was what the author says. Mark's Gospel writer says they come away to a deserted place. Jesus said to them, all by yourselves, and rest a while, because they had been working so hard. They weren't punishing them. This is the first clue about what is important for us to do in the work of liberation, to come to places like this, a place apart where we can be replenished and find rest for our souls. And then as they went ashore, this is the key verse of this passage. As Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd and he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. I love this verse. This to me is how Jesus makes a case for what a real leader is. He looked on their need. He didn't judge it. He didn't turn away from it. He looked on them, and the verse in the Bible says he had compassion on them. That means he identified with them. That's what the word means. I can see that the situation that you are in is one that I have either been in myself or am capable of falling into. There's no judgment in compassion. Compassion says, I am not better than you. And though I might have things together in this moment, I don't always, and I haven't always, and I might not always. Jesus has compassion because he sees their need, that they are like sheep without a shepherd. That means no one's watching out for them. No one's caring for them. Nobody cares if they live or if they die. And we know what it's like to be seen as marginal or disposable. Watching Pose on Sunday nights has reminded me of that period in the 1980s when people said about us, because we had people who had AIDS, were Haitians, hemophiliacs, sex workers, IV drug users, and homosexuals. They said things like, this is God's way of cleansing the population, or God's way of taking care of people who are expendable. That was another word that was used a lot. Jesus says, no one is expendable. And he looks for situations where their people are overwhelmed, and he sees them like sheep without a shepherd, meaning no one caring, no one protecting, all those characteristics that were articulated in Psalm 23 about what a good shepherd is, who a good shepherd is. That's what Jesus models then and now. And then later in the passage, when it says, they rushed about the whole region when they saw him, and they began to bring to him the sick on mats, and wherever they heard he was going to be. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplace and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. Contact with Jesus Christ meant then and means still that our circumstances are changed, that healing can happen, and that community can happen. And we don't have Jesus Christ physically present today in 2018, but we have people who remind us of Jesus. I think that Blanca is more of a leader than most religious leaders and most political leaders, and embodies the qualities and characteristics of Jesus, of caring for those who are like sheep without a shepherd, more than almost anyone I know. And that's why I like to watch that story, because it reminds me of what we are all capable of doing, of how we can step up right now. And I want to give one final example before I stop, because the intersection of the issues were so striking to me this week. In the people who were attracted to Jesus, they had an expectation that their physical healing could take place, that the stigma around them would be reduced, that their circumstances would be different because of all that was happening in the Jesus movement. When I saw this week that our government is planning to fund the ongoing detention of children and families by reallocating money from Ryan White funding. Did you see the story? Okay, so the government has Ryan White funds. I was a distributor of this in San Francisco for many years. And they're money of last resort, and they pay for primary medical care for people with HIV and AIDS, or other essential services to keep them alive. It can be housing, it can be dental care, it can be medical, but mostly it's medical care. And the government, I can't believe they're doing this. has decided to reallocate the money for that very important program named after Ryan White to fund the incarceration of children and families. This is what we're being called to pay attention to and to say, that same group of people who doesn't care about immigrant children or their families also does not care about people with HIV and AIDS. It's just one little example, but I wanted to lift it up here because of our history. Jesus looked upon the need and said, I have compassion. You're like sheep without a shepherd. But he's not here now. And Blanca, sadly, is only a TV character. We are the ones who have to look on the need, have compassion, stand up, and make a difference. And I come here because I believe that MCC Boston is engaging in a slow renewal and revival. I see it happening, I feel it, my instincts tell me that. What we do here is necessary and vital. And I hope we can feel that and become part of that renewal and revival, so that people who feel like they're overlooked, marginalized, expendable, know that there are people who look on them with compassion, because that's how we look on each other too. And we will step into that role of shepherd. Amen.